Listerdam announced itself to travelers long before it appeared on the horizon, not by the smell of its famous dye markets, though those were distinctive enough, a rich chemical sweetness of indigo and madder root that clung to clothing for days, but by the crows. They gathered in numbers that no natural explanation quite satisfied, wheeling in slow, deliberate circles above the city's rooftops, as if they were waiting for something to finish dying. Locals called them the Marquis birds, and said it with the specific flatness of people who had long ago made peace with an ominous thing they couldn't change. Sable Veyne arrived on foot, hood up, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided weeks ago what they were going to do, and was now simply in the process of doing it.
Draconato were not uncommon in cities of this size. Enough trade flowed through Listerdam that every species with commercial instincts passed through eventually. But Sable had learned early that not uncommon and unnoticed were different things, and that a draconato of his particular heritage required a specific kind of attention management. His scales were the deep blue-black of thunderclouds before lightning, iridescent at the edges where the light caught them, and his eyes were the pale silver of the deity whose service he had entered 11 years ago. The silver flame's mark was on him in ways that weren't always visible. A supple luminescence at his fingertips in darkness, a steadiness in his gaze that unsettled people who were hiding things, and an absolute incapacity for the kind of performative piety that gave religious service a bad reputation. He believed without demonstrating. He acted without announcing.
These were, in his estimation, the most honest forms of faith available. He was also, professionally speaking, one of the finest thieves currently operating on the continent's eastern seaboard, which his deity did not discourage, provided the targets were the right ones. The commission had come through the usual channels, a folded note delivered by a bird that was not a crow, left on the windowsill of the room he'd been renting in a coastal city 3 weeks south. The Silver Flame's instructions were rarely verbose. This one read, Listerdam, Marquis Aldrin Voss, the Codex Cruoris. Do not let it be used. 3 sentences, 11 years of working relationship with a divine power, and it had never needed more than that. He had spent the intervening 3 weeks learning everything he could about all 3 subjects.
The Marquis Aldrin Voss was 57, had governed Listerdam for 19 years through a combination of genuine administrative competence and methodical elimination of anyone who threatened to be better at it. He was not, by the accounts Sable had assembled, a stupid man, which made him more dangerous than the stupid ones. He had built Listerdam's dye trade into a regional monopoly, maintained functional roads and clean water, kept the peace with a city guard that was well paid and therefore loyal, and cultivated a reputation for fairness that was, Sable had concluded after reviewing 7 independent accounts, not entirely unearned. He was also, somewhere in the last 2 years, deeply changed. The accounts diverged on this point. Something had shifted in the Marquis 18 months ago. Decisions that had previously been pragmatic had become erratic. The city guard had quietly doubled in size. Taxes had risen without explanation.
3 merchants who had filed formal complaints had not disappeared exactly, but become very quiet very quickly. The crows had been present for longer than anyone remembered, but they had multiplied in the last year and a half. The Codex Cruoris was harder to research. Most serious occult archives had fragments, references, warnings, the kind of annotations that scholars left in margins when they encountered something they thought future researchers should approach carefully. An illuminated manuscript of unknown origin, bound in material that the most clinical descriptions noted as non-standard,
its pages filled with text in an ink that several sources described as having properties inconsistent with standard pigment.
The text itself, what little had been independently documented, was written in an archaic dialect of Infernal that specialized scholars described as coercive in structure, meaning the grammar itself was designed to bind rather than describe, to compel rather than communicate. The Codex didn't grant power, it recorded agreements. Specifically, it recorded agreements between its owner and entities that had no business making agreements with mortals, and the agreements, once written, were binding in ways that the weave itself enforced. Signing your name in its pages was not metaphor, it was contract law at a cosmic scale, and the ink, Sable had read 4 descriptions of it, and each one said the same thing in different words, was not ink. He had been in Listerdam for 6 hours when he noticed he was being followed. His shadow was good.
Professional-grade patience, the ability to move through a crowd while giving the impression of having a destination elsewhere, the tradecraft was clean. But Sable had spent 11 years operating in environments where being found meant being dead, and he had developed a sensory architecture for surveillance that ran below conscious thought. He didn't look back. He turned instead into a narrow lane between the dye market stalls, ostensibly examining a bolt of violet cloth, and used the reflection in the polished tin weight hanging from the merchant's scale to confirm what his instincts had already filed. A human, mid-30s, unremarkable face, wearing the kind of clothing specifically designed to be forgotten, moving with the careful weight distribution of someone trained not to make sound. Not city guard, they moved differently, with institutional confidence. Not a thief, wrong priority sequence. An operative then, someone working a job, not a beat.
The question was, whose operative, and did they know what Sable was here for? He bought the cloth, tucked it under his arm, and made a decision. Instead of going to the boarding house he'd arranged, he went to the Silver Quarter, the old ecclesiastical district, where 3 temples of varying denominations maintained their premises in various states of upkeep, and where, more relevantly, one particular establishment maintained a small annex that the Silver Flames network had established 7 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. The annex was a chandler's shop. The woman behind the counter was 60, round-faced, and wore the look of someone entirely at peace with the world, which Sable had learned was the most dangerous look in the intelligence community. Her name was Orla. She looked at him, looked at the street behind him, and said, "You have a tail." "I know," he said. "Do you know them?" "Not yet." She reached under the counter and produced a key.
"Second room, top of the stairs. Give me an hour." He gave her 40 minutes, which was what he had. When Orla came back, her expression had shifted to something more considered. "The operative is working for an entity called the Hollow Scribe," she said, "which is not a person." Sable went still. "It's a divine agent," Orla continued carefully, "not a deity itself, a servant of one. The theology is obscure, but the Hollow Scribe is historically associated with a particular domain. The preservation and completion of unfinished contracts, agreements of power that were begun but never finalized." She looked at him steadily. "The Codex Cruoris is full of unfinished contracts, Sable. Agreements the previous owners began and then stopped for one reason or another. The Hollow Scribe's patron wants them completed." "Which deity?" "The one the old texts called the Architect of Debts," Orla said. "The god of what is owed." Sable sat with that for a moment.
Outside, the crows turned overhead in their slow circles, and Listerdam went on with its commerce.
And somewhere in the Marquis' residence on the hill above the dye markets, a book full of unfinished promises waited with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry. "I need to get into the Marquis' estate," he said. "I know," Orla said. "I've been watching the Rhodas for 3 days. There's a window." The estate of Marquis Aldrin Voss occupied the highest point within Listerdam's inner walls, a sprawling construction of pale limestone and imported timber that managed to be both impressive and slightly wrong, the way things were slightly wrong when they had been built with great expense, but without love. The gardens were immaculate. The windows were always lit. The guards rotated on a schedule of aggressive regularity that suggested someone who had become, recently, very worried about something. Sable spent 2 days studying it before he moved.
He was thorough, the way only people who understood that patience was a form of respect for a problem could be thorough. On the 3rd night, an hour past the 2nd guard rotation, he went over the east wall. His entry was textbook, a misty step from the scroll case at his belt to clear the wall's 6-foot height, a period of stillness in the garden shadow to confirm the guard interval, then 3 minutes of careful movement through the ornamental hedge maze that the estate's previous owner had planted and the Marquis had maintained, because removing it would have been noticed. The silver flame's mark on his hands was suppressed. He had learned years ago to bank it the way you banked a fire, enough to keep it alive, but not enough to cast light. In darkness, he was very nearly invisible, his scales absorbed rather than reflected, and he moved with the specific economy of motion that came from years of operating in spaces where the wrong sound was the last one you made.
The private study was on the 3rd floor, east wing. Orla's intelligence had been precise. The lock was a standard mechanism with a secondary ward, not a spell, but a mechanical alarm, a pressure plate disguised as a floor tile immediately inside the threshold. Sable identified it by the way the tile didn't quite settle flush with its neighbors, and stepped over it with the ease of someone who had been reading floors for 20 years. The study was large, orderly, and deeply unpleasant. Not visibly. Visually, it was fine. Bookshelves, a writing desk, a fireplace banked to coals, 2 chairs. But the silver flame's mark, even suppressed, responded to its opposite the way a compass responds to north, and what it registered in this room was a sustained, low-frequency wrongness that Sable felt in his chest, behind his sternum, like a second heartbeat out of sync with his own.
The codex was in the desk's lower drawer, locked with both a physical mechanism and a word that Sable did not recognize immediately, then recognized with the specific unpleasant sensation of encountering something you hoped you wouldn't. It was a glyph of wording, but layered over something older, a coercive enchantment that was not standard with magic. It had the same structural quality as what the archival sources had described in the Codex's text itself, grammar designed to bind rather than describe. The glyph would trigger if the drawer were opened by someone who did not have the specific ownership connection that the Codex maintained with the Marquis, which was interesting because it meant the Codex had an ownership connection with the Marquis, which meant the Marquis had signed it. Sable crouched in the firelight and thought carefully about what that meant for his approach.
Direct removal was out. The ownership ward would register the separation and alert the Marquis, possibly the Codex itself. He needed to understand the nature of the connection before he could safely break it. He pulled his documentation kit from the inner pocket of his coat and began recording what he could see of the ward's structure, sketching the glyph's components in the small notebook he kept in compact cipher. He was on the 3rd sketch when the other operative came through the window. Not the one who had followed him through the market, a different one, same organizational affiliation.
This one was more direct, dropped from the window ledge with practiced ease, saw Sable immediately and went still in the posture of a professional who has run into another professional and is rapidly reassessing. They looked at each other across the room's width. "You're not here for the Marquis," the operative said, not a question. Her voice was low, controlled.
"Neither are you," Sable replied at the same volume. A pause. "The Hollow Scribe wants the Codex completed. The unfinished contracts. I know what the Hollow Scribe wants." Sable kept his hands visible and unthreatening, which was a conscious choice that the operative visibly registered. "Yes." Another pause, longer. She looked at the desk. "The Marquis signed it 18 months ago. He had a debt, a financial one, something that would have ended his career and possibly his freedom. The Codex appeared to him through a contact he trusted. He signed in the belief he was entering a manageable agreement. And the Codex doesn't have manageable agreements. It has escalating ones. The Marquis' first signing led to a second condition, which led to a third.
He's been recording names in it, other people's names, the names of his enemies, of people he wanted controlled. Each name he records deepens his own binding. He thinks he's using it." She said the last sentence with the precise flatness of someone delivering a judgment they had spent time arriving at. He doesn't understand that it's using him. Sable absorbed this. The Marquis as a man who had made a bad deal and was in progressively deeper, not a monster, not a true believer in whatever power the Codex served, but a frightened man who had picked up something he couldn't put down. "The Hollow Scribe wants to complete the unfinished contracts," he said. "What does that mean for Listerdam?" The operative looked at him with something that wasn't quite reluctant, but was adjacent to it. Every name in the Codex becomes formally bound to the architect of debts. The debts become real. The people who signed them, directly or through the Marquis, owe something they never consented to owe. She paused. There are 47 names in it currently. 47 people in this city who did not know that 18 months of a frightened Marquis' decisions had put them in a divine ledger. "I need to examine the ownership connection," Sable said. "There is a way to break it without destroying the Codex, which would just scatter the binding magic and make it worse. But I need information the Codex itself holds, about the Marquis' original contract, the first page." The operative was quiet for a moment. "I can get you that without triggering the ward," she said. He looked at her. "Why would you help me?" "Because my orders are to deliver the Codex to the Hollow Scribe for completion," she said. "And I am here in this room, telling you information that makes that harder. Draw your own conclusions about my current relationship with my orders." Her name, Sable would learn later, was Thessaly. That night she stood in the Marquis' study and looked at him with the expression of someone who has decided something recently and is still feeling the weight of it. "Show me the ward," she said. The first page of the Codex Cruoris was not what Sable expected. He had expected darkness, malice made visible. The occult archives he'd read had described the Codex in terms that implied a kind of aggressive wrongness, a thing that announced its nature without apology. What Thessaly's bypass of the ownership ward revealed, when they carefully opened the drawer under the combined suppression of her operative's toolkit and his silver flame mark, was something more insidious. Beauty. The first page was gorgeous.
Illuminated in a style that predated the current historical period by at least 4 centuries, its margins decorated with intricate knotwork in gold and deep purple, its text laid out in the kind of careful calligraphy that spoke of a craftsperson who had spent years achieving this specific quality. It looked like a devotional document from the hand of someone who loved their work. The illustrations in the margins were small, detailed, extraordinary, figures in motion, creatures that existed in no bestiary, patterns that the eye wanted to follow. It was designed to be desired. Every formal element of it had been constructed to make you want to read it, want to hold it, want to feel that proximity to its beauty was a privilege rather than a warning. Sable spent 15 seconds admiring it and then began looking for what was actually there. The ink was wrong up close. He had known it would be from the archival descriptions, but knowing and seeing were different.
Under the magnifier's lens from his kit, the ink's surface texture was faintly cellular, like something organic that had been fixed in place rather than something applied. It held the light in a way that spoke of moisture still present, which should have been impossible in a centuries-old document, but wasn't, because the ink was not ink. It was... He had read this word in 3 different archive documents, and each time it had seemed like overcautious hyperbole. But now, up close, he believed it. It was responsive. It moved, at the cellular level, in tiny increments, toward his hands, toward proximity, like a living thing that recognized the presence of something with its own vital force. The text of the Marquis's original contract was in the archaic infernal dialect the sources had described, but Sable read infernal in 4 dialects, and the coercive grammar, while unusual, was parsable.
He read it twice, cross-referencing against his memory of contract law as it operated at divine levels. The agreement was, as Thessaly had said, escalating. The Marquis had signed in exchange for the resolution of his financial debt, a specific sum, a specific creditor, a specific problem. In exchange, access to the Codex's binding function for 1 year, the ability to record names of individuals whose debts to the Marquis were formally bound. In the fine architecture of the coercive grammar, buried in a dependent clause that only became visible when you read the whole sentence backward as the infernal syntax occasionally required. And all names so recorded, and the name of the recorder, are held in perpetual obligation to the architect until the Codex is completed or destroyed. Completed meant all current contracts finalized, the hollow scribe's delivery accomplished, the architect of debts receiving 47 souls worth of divine leverage. Destroyed was the alternative. And destruction of the Codex would scatter the binding magic. Sable had been right about that, releasing the connections in an uncontrolled dispersal that would harm every person whose name was in it. There was a third option in the text, and it took him 6 careful minutes to find it. Not in the main body of the contract, in the illuminated border, in the knotwork pattern in the lower right corner, which was not decorative but structural, a second clause, hidden in the visual design, that the Marquis had certainly never seen, and the hollow scribe presumably hoped no one would. The Codex had been made by someone. Someone had crafted this beautiful, terrible thing, and that someone had built in a release mechanism. If the recorder's debt is paid in full, the hidden clause read, the Codex returns to its unwritten state. All bindings dissolve. The architect's claim is void. His original debt, Sable said quietly, the financial one, if it's paid.
The original contract is satisfied, Thessaly said. She was reading over his shoulder, following his finger on the knotwork. The escalating conditions all derive from the original agreement. Pay the original debt. And the Marquis's signing is retroactively fulfilled. The Codex has nothing to enforce. He sat back. Do you know the amount? Yes, she said. I researched the Marquis extensively. A pause. It's significant. How significant? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. I have access to Silver Flame operational funds, he said. Not unlimited, but it's covered, Thessaly said. Between what I've accessed in the last 4 years operating for the Hollow Scribes network and what I intend to stop doing as of now. She looked at him with the expression of someone making a decision in real time and not entirely regretting it. It's covered. Before Sable could respond, the study door opened.
The Marquis Aldren Voss stood in the doorway in his dressing robe, a lamp in one hand, and looked at the 2 strangers crouched beside his open desk drawer, with an expression that moved through shock and landed on something more complicated. A man who had been waiting for something to happen and was not surprised that it had come. He looked at the Codex. He looked at Sable's silver-lit hands. He looked at Thessaly. "You know what it is," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," Sable said. The Marquis set the lamp down on the mantelpiece with the careful movements of someone controlling something. In the firelight, his face looked older than his years, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion of a person who has been afraid for a very long time. "I couldn't put it down," he said. "Once I signed, I couldn't. The alternatives kept disappearing. Every time I thought about removing it, something happened that made keeping it seem necessary." He looked at the Codex. "It thinks for itself."
"It does," Sable said, "but we found the exit." The Marquis looked at him, and Sable, who had spent 11 years reading faces in rooms where honesty was dangerous, saw what was there. Not relief yet, because it was too early for relief, but the precursor to it, the loosening of something long held tight. "Tell me," said Marquis Aldrin Voss. In the hallway outside the study, the operative from the Hollow Scribes network, the one who had followed Sable through the market, now alerted by some communication Sable hadn't intercepted, was moving toward the door, and from the street below, 2 more were converging on the estate's east wall. They had perhaps 6 minutes. The 6 minutes were, in Sable's professional estimation, the most efficiently used 6 minutes of his career.
He explained the release clause in 90 seconds, the mechanics of the payment in 45, and then gave the Marquis 30 seconds to make his decision, not out of coldness, but because the 3 operatives converging on the estate were not coming to negotiate, and every second of hesitation was a second's worth of ground lost. The Marquis did not hesitate. He opened the desk's upper drawer, removed a sealed document that Sable recognized as a standing letter of credit, and signed it over with the particular decisive penmanship of a man who had been making administrative decisions under pressure for 19 years and had not forgotten how to act quickly when the situation required it. Thessaly took the document. "This will process at the Mercantile Exchange when it opens," she said. "The creditor is the Greenway Consortium. I know their representative here. They'll confirm receipt." "How long?" Sable asked. 2 hours after opening, dawn +3.
Which meant the payment wasn't processed yet, which meant the Codex still held its bindings for the next several hours, which meant the Hollow Scribes operatives, arriving in approximately 4 minutes, would still find an active artifact capable of being delivered. Sable looked at the Codex. The Codex, in the way of things with cellular-level awareness of their environment, seemed to look back. "I need to carry it," he said, "out of the estate, away from the operatives, until the payment clears." "You can't touch it," Thessaly said immediately, "without the ownership connection. I don't need to touch the pages. I need to contain it." He was already opening the specialized case from the deepest pocket of his coat. Not something he'd expected to use, something Orla had pressed on him before he left the chandler's shop, with the specific grim practicality of someone who planned for the worst professionally.
A lead-lined case, interior warded with silver flame consecration, applied painstakingly over 3 years by a priest he trusted. Enough to suppress the Codex's reaching quality, its tendency toward proximity. Not enough to break the binding. Enough to carry it safely. The case will hold it long enough. He looked at the Marquis. The operatives are here for the Codex. If it's gone, they have no reason to harm you or your household. Let them search. You found the desk open. You know nothing. The Marquis looked at him with the expression of someone doing a rapid moral accounting. "You're trusting me not to tell them which direction you went." "Yes," Sable said simply. Something moved in the Marquis's face, the same precursor to relief, arriving faster this time. He straightened his dressing robe, picked up his lamp,
and said with the voice of a man resuming his normal register, "The East Servants' Passage exits behind the stable block."
The guard rota leaves a 30-second gap at the north postern on the quarter hour. Sable nodded once. He lifted the codex into the case using 2 folded pieces of leather to avoid direct contact, closed and latched it, and felt the suppression ward engage with the particular click that weavework made in the bone of his hand when it worked correctly. They went out through the East Servants' Passage. The 3 hours that followed were the kind of operational work that Sable would never fully describe to anyone because it was, in essence, unglamorous. Movement through pre-dawn city streets, the management of 2 separate pursuit contacts, a 20-minute period in the cellar of a cooperage that Orla had designated as a secondary shelter, and a conversation between him and Thessaly, sitting on barrels in the dark with the lead-lined case between them, about the nature of obligations. "The Hollow Scribes network will know I broke," she said. "Yes. There will be consequences."
Probably. He looked at the case. Inside it, even suppressed, the codex exerted a gravitational quality. Not magical, just the weight of what it was. The Silver Flames network can provide cover. Not protection, I won't promise what I can't deliver. But cover. A new operational context. People who know how to disappear someone who needs disappearing. "I don't want to disappear," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "That's not what I meant." When the mercantile exchange opened, and Thessaly presented the letter of credit to the Greenway Consortium's representative, the transaction took 11 minutes to process and confirm. Sable sat outside on a bench and watched the pigeons, which were not crows and had nothing particular to say about anything. He felt the moment the payment cleared. Not through any arcane sense, he felt it in the case. The gravitational quality shifted. The weight changed.
Not lighter, exactly, but different. The weight of something inert rather than something straining. He opened the case carefully, used the leather guards to open the codex's cover, and looked at the first page. The illumination was still there, the knotwork, the gold borders, the extraordinary calligraphy. But the ink was different. It was dry. Genuinely, completely dry. The cellular level moisture was gone, the responsiveness extinguished. The text was still present, but changed. The coercive grammar's structure collapsed, the words rearranged by some internal mechanism into simple, descriptive language that read in flat, archaic infernal. "This agreement is satisfied. The debt is paid. The obligation is void." He turned to the pages where the Marquis had recorded the 47 names. Blank. Every one of them. The ink had reversed, drawn back into whatever the ink had been, leaving the pages pristine, old, slightly yellowed, but unwritten.
47 people in Listerdam who would wake up today with no idea how close they had come to a debt they'd never agreed to carry. Sable sat with the open codex in the early morning light and felt the silver flame's mark warm at his fingertips, not in response to threat for once, but in the simple acknowledgement of something finished rightly. He thought about the Marquis, who would spend a long time working out whether the last 18 months constituted something he needed to reckon with. He thought about Thessaly, who was standing 20 feet away, watching the street, with the posture of someone who had just changed the category of the next several years of their life. He thought about the hidden knotwork clause. Someone, centuries ago, had made this terrible, beautiful book and built a way out into its borders, had refused to make the trap entirely inescapable.
He thought about that unknown craftsperson, whose name was nowhere in any archive,
who had looked at what they were being asked to create and had done it, and hidden the exit inside the art. He closed the codex. He put it back in the case, which now contained, by his assessment, an extremely old, extremely well-made, entirely inert illuminated manuscript, whose primary distinction was the quality of its knotwork borders. He snapped the case shut. "Done," he said. Thessaly turned from the street. Her face was the face of someone who had been very focused on a particular direction for a long time, and had just looked up to find the horizon was different than expected. "What happens to the book?" she asked. "I know an archive," he said, "warded. The curator is discreet, and has good professional ethics about provenance." He stood, adjusted his coat, tucked the case under one arm. "It deserves to be understood rather than destroyed. It was made by someone who mattered."
She was quiet for a moment. "And the Marquis?" "The Marquis has 47 people to govern considerably better than he has been for the last 18 months, Sable said. "That's not a small task. I suspect he knows it." They walked out together into Listerdam's morning, which was loud with market commerce, and the smell of dye and the ordinary friction of people going about their necessary lives, and the crows, still present, still circling, seemed to Sable's eye to be fewer than before, or perhaps just less purposeful, turning in their slow circles with the vague, habitual quality of things that had stayed past their reason. He did not look back at them. He walked toward the silver quarter, and the chandler's shop, and whatever Orla had decided to involve him in next.
The Codex Cruoris arrived at the archival house of Corenthal 14 days after Sable left Listerdam, accompanied by a letter of 16 pages that the head curator, Orendalt, read 3 times before sitting very still for several minutes and then writing back a response that ran to 4 pages and contained the phrase "extraordinary find" in the first paragraph, the third paragraph, and the closing sentence, which told Sable everything he needed to know about how Oren was taking the news. The archive's conservation team spent 3 months documenting the codex before concluding what Sable had observed in the cooperage cellar. Inert, the artifact was genuinely beautiful. The unknown craftsperson's skill was extraordinary. The illuminations were unlike anything in the existing record, a distinct stylistic tradition that the team's art historian called pre-convergence coercive devotional, which was a new category that she invented specifically for this object.
The hidden knotwork clause was analyzed at length. Nobody could agree on who had built it in or why, but the consensus, published quietly in a restricted monograph, was that whoever it had been understood that they were making something that would harm people and had refused to make it irremediable. An act of conscience inside an act of compulsion, the monograph concluded. The identity of the craftsperson is unknown. Their influence persists. In Listerdam, Marquis Aldrin Voss reduced the city guard to its previous size, reversed 3 of the more inexplicable tax measures, and initiated a formal review process for the cases of the 3 merchants who had gone quiet. He did this without announcement, without explanation, and without inviting any kind of public acknowledgement.
The city noticed anyway, in the way cities noticed things, through the texture of daily life, through the specific quality of bureaucratic encounters that were slightly less hostile than they had been, through the gradual cessation of the crows. They did not disappear immediately. They thinned over a period of weeks, the slow dispersal of a gathered thing whose reason for gathering had resolved, until one morning, Carver, the head of the Marquis' household staff, realized he hadn't seen one in 3 days and mentioned it to no one, because there was nothing really to say. The Hollow Scribes network withdrew from Listerdam. Whether this was a response to Thessaly's defection, the loss of the Codex, or simply the pragmatic calculation that there was nothing more to be accomplished, Sable never learned. The architect of debts did not make formal responses to mortal events. Divine powers of that kind operated on timescales that individual losses unremarkable.
The debt remained. 47 names had been written and erased. A contract had been completed through payment rather than completion. Whether the architect found this satisfying or frustrating was a theological question that Sable was content to leave unanswered. Thessaly spent 3 weeks in Listerdam. She was not, in that time, hiding. She moved through the city openly, relearning the practice of existing without surveillance architecture, which turned out to be a skill that required deliberate reconstruction. She visited the dye markets. She ate at establishments she chose for reasons of personal preference rather than tactical positioning. She walked by the river in the early morning and did not check whether anyone was behind her. On the 22nd day, a message arrived through Orla's network, an address in a city 2 weeks north, a contact name, a brief note in Sable's careful cipher that translated as, "When you're ready, no deadline."
She left on the 23rd day, which was not quite the same as being ready, but was, she decided, close enough. In the chandler's shop in Listerdam's Silver Quarter, Orla added a new entry to her operational log. Codex Cruoris, resolved. Secondary asset, converted. Primary operative, already asking about the next one. She closed the log. She lit a candle. A professional habit, but also a personal one. A small act of acknowledgement to the silver flame that was neither pious nor performative, but simply honest. The flame steadied. Outside, the morning went on. And in the archive in Corinthal, the Codex Cruoris rested in a conservation box in a climate-controlled room in the restricted collection, its pages blank and its borders luminous. A beautiful made thing, waiting with the patience of beautiful made things for someone to understand it fully, which the craftsperson who had hidden the exit in the knotwork had perhaps known was the only kind of completion that mattered.